A case that shook America, the introduction. When people imagine the American West, they often think of endless blue skies, sweeping pine forests, and quiet neighborhoods nestled between mountains and lakes. The state of Nevada in particular brings to mind the neon glow of Reno, the crystal-clear water of Lake Tahoe, and the serene beauty of the Great Basin National Park. For most residents and visitors alike, life in suburban Nevada has an undercurrent of tranquility, a place where neighbors exchange friendly nods during their morning walks, and families enjoy evenings on the porch, sipping iced tea while children play in the yard. But every so often, even the most peaceful corners of the world harbor secrets darker than the surrounding night. It is within one such suburban oasis just on the outskirts of Reno that a disturbing mystery began to unfold in the late summer of 2006. The neighborhood at Evergreen Lane was known for its tree-lined streets, well-kept lawns and friendly block parties celebrating everything from the 4th of July to the dawn of the school year. Parents trusted their children to ride bikes along winding sidewalks, and the sound of laughter would drift through open windows on balmy evenings. Outsiders could hardly imagine a more classic, idyllic slice of American suburbia. However, beneath this charming facade, something sinister lurked out of sight, a truth that would soon shatter the sense of security for every resident. On one seemingly ordinary day, an unusual stench began to drift through the community. At first it was attributed to overflowing trash bins, perhaps roadkill tucked out of sight, but as the odor grew stronger and days went by without relief, unease crept in. Conversations grew hushed, eyes darted toward the source, and speculation spiraled into anxiety. Whispers spread from stoop to stoop. Had a wild animal gotten trapped, or was something worse at play? The mystery of Evergreen Lane would soon explode into national headlines, captivating the attention of amateur sleuths and seasoned detectives alike. What transpired in the tightly woven Morgan household would chill even the most skeptical minds. The events to come exposed cracks in the quintessential American family portrait and sent ripples of dread across the state. This case would not only ignite a desperate search for answers but would leave scars, both literal and emotional, that lingered long after doors were locked and questions faded into the unsolved shadows of the past. The tale of what happened on Evergreen Lane is a reminder that sometimes horror resides right next door. As you journey with me through this investigation, prepare to reconsider everything you believe about family, trust, and the thin line dividing everyday life from the unimaginable. The first signs of tragedy. It began as something annoyingly mundane, a strange smell that seemed to creep its way through the idyllic cul-de-sac of Evergreen Lane. At first a few neighbors shrugged it off, assuming maybe someone forgot trash day, or perhaps a stray animal had met its unfortunate end beneath a porch. In suburban America, with its meticulously manicured lawns and home association rules, odd smells were not exactly the norm, but neither were they unheard of. After all, sometimes a skunk might wander too close or a compost bin gets left open in the summer heat. Yet this time, the odor had a persistence and intensity that was impossible to ignore. Over several days, the smell grew worse, morphing from a simple irritation into something almost sinister. It hung in the air, heavier each morning, clinging to window screens and drifting onto patios, invading every breakfast and every evening walk. People began to talk, at first in passing, then in more urgent tones. Was someone storing old fish in the garage? Had a sewage pipe burst? Children, usually eager to cut across lawns or play tag near the White House at the end of the lane, suddenly started avoiding that corner, wrinkling their noses as they sped by. Residents began taking small actions. Some sprayed air fresheners near their doors, others called their pest control companies just in case. Theories multiplied, and soon the community's online message board buzzed with speculation. The Smith family posted a query late one night, asking if anyone else noticed that awful stench. Mrs. Ramirez, a spry retiree known for her morning strolls, mentioned she hadn't seen the Morgans, the family in the White House, for a while. The Morgans were private but not unfriendly, so their sudden silence seemed odd, yet not quite alarming, at least not yet. A few residents decided to rally together, organizing a walk-around one muggy evening after dinner. With flashlights in hand and faces tight with concern, they sniffed at hedges and poked around garbage bins, but nothing provided a clear answer. The smell was strongest right in front of the Morgan residence, number 737. Trash bins were empty, and the house, curiously, was dark and quiet. No lights flickered behind the freshly washed curtains. No car idled in the driveway. Whispers swelled into anxious conversations. the persistent, overwhelming odor, and the absence of the Morgan family grew impossible to dismiss. As another hot day faded into a tense, silent night, someone pulled out their smartphone and dialed the non-emergency police number. The hope that whatever was happening on Evergreen Lane could be explained away with a simple, harmless cause. Little did they know the truth would be far more disturbing than any of them could have imagined. The police step in. If you ever want to witness a community's transformation from quiet indifference to collective anxiety, spend a day on a peaceful American suburban street immediately after a crime is suspected. That's exactly what happened on Willowbrook Avenue the evening local police officially became involved. At first, most officers were skeptical. The 911 dispatcher fielded a handful of complaints about a terrible stench coming from a home that, until now, had been just another puzzle piece in the tranquil patchwork of the neighborhood. In the past, disturbances here ran the gamut from noisy barbecues gone too late to the occasional squabble about parking spots or misplaced trash bins. But that evening something was different. The dispatch log filled with reports of a foul odor that had grown too powerful to ignore, and the absence of the Mitchell family only deepened the concern. Responding to what they assumed was a routine neighborhood nuisance call, the police assigned Officer Rebecca Harlow and her rookie partner to check out 312 Willowbrook, a two-story colonial with a white porch swing and a mailbox that still displayed the Mitchell's family name. When they arrived, the air was thick, heavy, and nearly suffocating. Standing beside them was the Neighborhood Association president, a retired firefighter named George Connors, who had been summoned thanks to his role as both local mediator and unofficial detective. Officer Harlow knocked several times, calling out for anyone inside. The porch light flickered in the fading daylight, but no voices answered, and no shadows moved within. George circled the side of the house, squinting through smudged windows in hopes of spotting a family member or even a pet, which, in better times, might have been his only worry. The officers tried the doorknob, but found it locked tight, reinforced with a sturdy deadbolt. They paused, a procedure dictated by both caution and necessity, before opting to call in a local locksmith. As the locksmith steadily worked his tools, neighbors gathered across the street, quiet but vigilant, whispering their own theories behind cupped hands. With a final metallic click, the front door creaked open, and the true strength of the odor assaulted everyone at once. Flies burst out as if the dark interior itself wanted to eject its secrets. Flashlights at the ready, the officers and George exchanged tense glances before stepping inside, bracing themselves for whatever lay within the Mitchell's home. The first floor appeared eerily normal. The television remote lay on the sofa, a half-empty glass of lemonade rested on the kitchen counter, and a stack of unread mail waited just inside the door, yet nobody answered their calls. Each closet, pantry, and hallway was checked in turn. It was as though the family had simply vanished, leaving their possessions but taking their presence away entirely. Undeterred, Officer Harlow led the way up the stairs where the smell intensified to a near-physical force. She radioed for backup and quietly reported that something was seriously wrong. As they reached the upper landing, their nerves sat on a knife edge. No amount of training could have prepared them for what awaited on that sultry September night. Neighbors stepped further back, and a hush fell over Willowbrook Avenue, the kind of quiet that signals a turning point from which there is no easy return. The real investigation had just begun, and nobody, especially not the officers, would ever be quite the same again. Shocking discovery on the third floor. As Officer Harlow and her team reached the end of their preliminary sweep inside the home, the oppressive silence was broken only by the persistent drone of flies, and a sour, heavy odor seeping through the wallpaper. They had found nothing conclusive on the first two floors. Bills piled up on the hallway table, an unfinished puzzle frozen in time atop the coffee table, a family portrait gathering dust on the wall. Yet something about the house felt strangely off, as if the heart of the place had been yanked out and replaced by dread. The group hesitated at the foot of the staircase leading to the third floor, their flashlights blinking in the gathering dusk. Even without saying a word, everyone knew it. Whatever nightmare was rotting the soul of this home, it awaited above. The officers tightened their grips on their belts. Mr. Connors, the ex-firefighter with nerves of steel, instinctively closed ranks with the officers, as if bracing for a wave of heat he could not see. Step by creaking step they ascended. The smell became almost unbearable, mingling the coppery tang of decay with something sweet, artificial, like rotting fruit left too long in the sun. At the landing, shadows pooled around their shoes. The air felt thicker up here, saturated with something no one wanted to name. Suddenly, a faint buzzing intensified as they inched forward. At the end of the hall, a single bathroom door was only slightly ajar, just enough for the light to spill a ghastly slice onto the warped floorboards. The stench surged. Officer Harlow, breathing shallowly through the collar of her shirt, quietly signaled her partner to cover her as she reached out, palms sweating, to push the door open. The resistance was immediate, a dull thump, like the door was wedged from within. She braced herself and pushed harder. The hinges shrieked. With one final shove, the door lurched sparingly open, and the full horror of the scene slammed into the group. Flies erupted in a furious black cloud, swirling around the room's foul epicenter. There, in the dim illumination, lay a sight no one present would ever be able to erase. 5 bodies, entangled and shrouded in heavy quilts, littered the bathroom's narrow, suffocating space. Every inch of the tile floor was streaked with a dark, viscous fluid. Several of the bodies had nylon bags tied cruelly over their heads, duct tape sealing any hope of breath. Limbs were bound with rope, the knots almost methodical, and the room, barely 6 square meters, felt somehow much smaller, filled with such tragedy. For a moment time froze, not a single soul spoke. The magnitude of the evil, the deliberate planning, the absence of anything resembling mercy or compassion, pressed down on everyone like an invisible hand to the throat. Officer Harlow's partner managed only a strangled, "Oh God." With trembling hands and the world spinning in her ears, Harlow radioed for the forensics team. Evidence markers and cameras would soon fill the tight space, but in that instant, all she could think was, who could do this, and why am I looking at the wreckage left behind by such monstrous intent? As neighbors crowded out on the lawn, investigators filed in and out, and Willowbrook Avenue's nocturnal stillness snapped into the relentless flash of police activity. What occurred in that small, unremarkable bathroom above a typical American street would haunt every soul who entered it, and mark the start of a relentless search for answers to a riddle too gruesome for words. The identities of the victims. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the haze of police lights on Evergreen Lane, the grim task facing law enforcement was clear: to establish the identities of the 5 victims discovered in the cramped, shadowed bathroom on the Morgan family's 3rd floor. The room itself seemed frozen in time, silent witnesses to a tragedy that demanded answers. Forensic specialists and detectives worked side by side, painstakingly cataloging each detail, determined to treat the victims with dignity amidst the chaos and media frenzy blossoming outside the crime scene tape. The identification process was complicated not because these were anonymous strangers, but because they were so very familiar. The neighbors, who only a week before had traded pleasantries with the Morgan children as they rode their bikes or walked to school, now watched in horror as personal belongings emerged from evidence bags. Photographs, school assignment folders, hand-decorated backpacks, and beloved toys were gently removed and logged, each item stirring a new wave of sorrow in the hearts of the officers and civilian witnesses alike. Through methodical examination and cross-referencing with school records, dental charts, and recent family photographs provided in trembling hands by local relatives, the authorities were able to confirm the unspeakable truth. The victims were the 5 Morgan children. David, just entering adulthood at 18, whose dreams of college had filled recent family conversations. Mark, the reliable and introverted 17-year-old who loved chess and walked his younger sisters to school every morning. Ben, age 15, an aspiring guitarist. Jessica, 12, bright and lively, whose laughter had so recently echoed through the neighborhood. And Amy, 9, the youngest, whose artwork filled the windows of the house with color and hope. What struck many was the complete absence of any signs of resistance. Investigators found no evidence of a struggle, and the cause of death for each child was determined to be suffocation, both quick and silent, leaving little room for escape or protest. This detail gnawed at the conscience of every adult on the scene, especially the detectives who were themselves parents, siblings, or members of close-knit families. How could 5 young people, healthy and spirited, be so cruelly taken in their own home, without a single cry for help reaching the outside world? As local media began releasing the victims' names and ages, a pall of disbelief settled over the entire Reno region. Vigils sprouted on front lawns. Flowers, stuffed animals, candles, and hand-painted signs bearing messages of love and outrage lined the curb outside 737 Evergreen Lane. Friends, teachers, and neighbors gathered in silence, united in grief, but searching desperately for understanding. In the immediate aftermath, the focus shifted to the remaining members of the Morgan family. Where were Thomas and Linda Morgan, the parents? Their absence was both a source of fear, had they too become victims, and dark suspicion. As the scope of the horror became clear, and as the details of the children's final hours came into sharper focus, the investigation unfolded, driven by a community's demand for justice and the haunting memories of 5 young lives lost far too soon. The investigation begins. The immediate aftermath of the grisly discovery on Evergreen Lane spun the quiet community into a whirlwind of rumors, speculation, and grief. Even as the coroner's van drove away and investigators worked into the early morning, a sense of deep unsettlement settled in, a collective realization that this was no ordinary tragedy. For local law enforcement and the wider investigative team, the complexity and brazenness of the crime required an all-consuming commitment, methodical patience, and a refusal to settle for easy answers. From the outset, the investigation was a logistical and emotional challenge. The once welcoming Morgan house, now sequestered behind yellow tape, became the epicenter of an intense, multi-layered inquiry. Every entryway, every creak of the floorboards, and every fleck of dust was now evidence, each detail a potential clue pointing toward the truth or perhaps a devastating diversion. Within hours, a mobile command center was established directly outside the property. Detectives from Reno's Major Crimes Unit assembled in rotating shifts. Forensic analysts pored over not only the bathroom where the bodies had been found, but the entire house, yard, vehicles, and even trash bins. More than 100 pieces of physical evidence were cataloged in the first 12 hours. Fingerprints smeared on doorknobs, shoe prints on the dusty attic floor, a torn scrap of what appeared to be a bank document half burned in the fireplace. Tech teams painstakingly examined computers and mobile phones, searching for digital breadcrumbs, emails unsent, texts erased, search histories wiped, but not irrecoverable. Every Tuesday's routine had become an all-hands-on-deck battle for answers. The first, and perhaps most challenging task, was to re-establish a timeline. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, retracing the footsteps of each Morgan family member in the days and hours before the children's deaths. Their work unearthed a patchwork of observations. Mrs. Ramirez, the ever-watchful retiree, last saw the Morgan children playing in the yard the Saturday before the discovery. Another neighbor, mowing his lawn the next day, recalled seeing Thomas Morgan's car leaving the driveway unusually early. One teenager across the street noted that Linda Morgan hadn't returned their waves in more than a week, her expression haunted and distracted the last time she was visible through the kitchen window. As interviews multiplied, so did contradictions. While some neighbors offered routine recollections, others shared anecdotes that set investigators on edge. Had anyone entered or left the property late at night? Who were the strangers, if any, seen around the Morgan house in the preceding weeks? Every answer branched into a web of new questions. Beyond the neighborhood perimeter, detectives widened their lens. The Morgan family's financial records were subpoenaed and reviewed with a fine-toothed comb. This was no small operation. Hundreds of files, online transactions, and paper receipts chronicled years of their life, and what investigators found was disturbing. A pattern of mounting debt, unusual cash withdrawals, and payments to unfamiliar accounts began to suggest powerful financial stress, weighing down on Thomas and Linda Morgan. But motive would not be so easily assumed. The team was determined not to let assumptions cloud the search for hard proof. The press soon descended on Evergreen Lane in droves, adding pressure from the outside. National media outlets, true crime bloggers, and cable news vans formed a gauntlet at the street's entrance. The lead investigator, Detective Charlotte Reyes, became a reluctant public face for the operation, holding nightly briefings with carefully measured information. "We are following every lead," she repeated. But behind closed doors, the stakes and strain were not so easily managed. Officers faced a growing stack of tips, phone logs, witness statements, and forensic results, each requiring cross-verification and, in many cases, dead ends. Inside the crime scene, every detail mattered. The peculiar arrangement of the bodies, the methodical bindings, and the airtight nature of the bathroom all suggested a grim level of planning and control. Forensic pathologists examined not just the victims' bodies but the remnants of food found in the kitchen, searching for any indication of sedatives or toxins. Lab technicians tested everything from carpet fibers to a half-empty bottle of pills discovered in an upstairs drawer. No item, no matter how trivial it might have seemed in a normal home, was disregarded. Outside the house, officers traced camera footage from nearby intersections, hoping to capture the Morgans' comings and goings in the days leading up to the murders. Long hours were spent reviewing grainy video, logging every delivery truck and passing car, even reviewing footage from gas stations and convenience stores miles away. Detective Reyes and her partner often worked until the sun rose, their eyes bloodshot, but their conviction undimmed. The investigation also brought to light the strain on those tasked with finding answers. Many of the officers, reporters, and community stakeholders were parents themselves, struggling to maintain objectivity amidst a case that cut so close to the heart. The school the Morgan children attended brought in grief counselors, while local churches organized vigils and prayer groups. Flyers featuring the parents' faces, labeled "Missing" in bold red, blanketed telephone poles and community boards. Hotline numbers were broadcast hourly on the radio, with appeals for any information about the Morgans' last known movements. Suspicions shifted as layers of the family's private life were peeled back. The timeline of the parents' disappearance became a focal point. Neither Thomas nor Linda's credit cards had been used since the night of the murders. Surveillance failed to capture their faces or license plate outside county limits, and their passports were found locked inside a bedroom dresser. No travel plans, airline tickets, or bus reservations were found, raising stark possibilities. Had they left on foot? Were they abducted? Or had they chosen a more elaborate method to vanish? The team interviewed extended family, old colleagues, friends, and school associates. Some described the Morgans as loving and responsible, while others depicted a couple increasingly withdrawn, plagued by whispered arguments and a sense of intangible doom. Several witnesses mentioned Thomas visiting pawn shops, selling family heirlooms, acts that in hindsight might have signaled a private desperation long obscured by public appearances. Throughout it all, forensic breakthroughs became beacons in the fog of uncertainty. DNA evidence, stray hairs, unidentified fingerprints, fibers, was rushed to labs. Some prints matched the Morgans and children as expected, others did not, sparking fresh rounds of interviews and background checks. Advanced chemical analysis of materials from the bathroom, the children's bed sheets, even the garden shed, searched for signs of rare substances or compounds that might link the crime to outside actors, or trace the final actions of the killers. The wider context of the case also could not be ignored. Social media chatter, online message boards, and even amateur sleuth forums began unraveling public theories. Was the Morgans' financial collapse tied to organized crime? Could an outside party have staged an elaborate kidnapping or revenge plot? Or was the answer, as some investigators began to fear, locked within the family unit itself? Detective Reyes's team leaned on psychological profilers to map out potential motives and behaviors that could explain the horrific scene. They combed through every aspect of the Morgans' lives, medical records looking for histories of mental illness or addiction, childhood traumas noted in old social work files, even seemingly innocuous details such as recent changes in sleep medication or insurance coverage. Anything that might illuminate a sudden break from normalcy or a descent into planning the unthinkable was fair game. Meanwhile, the practicalities of a high-profile, high-stakes investigation weighed heavily on departmental resources. Officers drove from Nevada to California, following up on one car rental lead. Another spent days manning a tip line after rumors circulated that Linda had been spotted at an out-of-state casino. Each false lead was diligently logged and reported. No avenue was dismissed outright, for fear that a single overlooked detail could mean the difference between a cold case and long-awaited justice. Months passed under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. The community's patience ran thin, and frustration boiled over at open town halls. Still, the investigative corps refused to yield to pressure. Piece by piece, they reconstructed the Morgans' final days. Phone records, security logs, bank statements, and neighbor testimony finally began to align, building toward a picture as tragic as it was damning. It became clear that the tragedy on Evergreen Lane was not isolated from broader struggles of debt, secrecy, and personal collapse, and as the investigators closed in, the answers waiting at the end of their search would upend everything they thought they knew about the family next door. The search for clues, unraveling the web. Once the shockwaves of the crime's discovery had faded into a grim determination, the investigation entered its most painstaking phase. The exhaustive search for clues that could lead to either Thomas and Linda Morgan or any other potential suspects who might have orchestrated the tragedy. The police, no longer simply preserving a crime scene, transformed their inquiry into a relentless hunt for answers. and that meant peeling back the layers of the Morgan family's life piece by piece, hour by hour. The house on Evergreen Lane, sealed off and closely monitored, effectively became a labyrinth filled with secrets. For the investigators, it was essential to approach each room, drawer, and possession not merely as physical objects but as silent witnesses to the strange drama that had unfolded. Walls were checked for hidden safes, floorboards creaked under the persistent weight of searchers, and every closet was emptied, searching for overlooked evidence: a handwritten note, a set of missing keys, a torn family photograph that might point toward motive or intent. Evidence technicians spent hours dusting for fingerprints on doorknobs, windowsills, even the backs of family picture frames. Shoe prints traced through the dustier corners of the attic yielded partial impressions, prompting a series of comparisons with both known family footwear and a database of possible visitors. The search extended into the backyard, where cadaver dogs swept the grass and gardens, and metal detectors retraced every inch near the property's fence. For the officers involved, nothing was too mundane to merit examination. Even the contents of the household trash were spread across tarps and sifted item by item under the bright glare of halogen lights. Beyond the four walls of the house, detectives began to map out the last known movements of Thomas and Linda Morgan. The lack of any apparent struggle or forced entry suggested uncomfortably that the assailants had been members of the household itself, or at least someone intimately familiar with its rhythms and access points. With the parents missing and their personal effects left behind, the sense of urgency only grew. It was as if two important chess pieces had vanished mid-game, and the investigators needed to reconstruct every possible move. Investigators pored over surveillance footage collected from nearby traffic signals, local convenience stores, and neighborhood security cameras. Officers knocked on scores of doors, asking about unfamiliar faces, strange vehicles, or curious deliveries in the days leading up to the murders. One particularly diligent team member assembled a rough timeline based on cell phone tower pings associated with the Morgan family's phones, cross-referenced with credit card records and the family's online activity. While most electronic trails dried up abruptly right after the murders, the data helped stitch together a map of routine and deviation: the rare late-night walk, the unexpected trip to a hardware store, and email correspondence that ceased mid-conversation. In the heart of the investigation, aided by state and federal databases, analysts began running down every name that surfaced. School records were checked for unusual absences or troubling reports about the Morgan children. Social workers and counselors were interviewed, not just for recent worries but for any pattern that might reveal a change in family dynamics. Interview transcripts piled up, each one carefully annotated and cross-examined, searching for a loose thread or inconsistency. The fact that so many people reported the Morgans as struggling but loving only served to deepen the enigma. Technological evidence, laptops, tablets, and mobile phones became battlegrounds for digital forensics teams. Encrypted files were painstakingly opened, erased text messages reconstructed, and browser histories resurrected from seemingly wiped hard drives. On one device, a calendar reminder for an unremarkable dental appointment. On another, a folder of encrypted financial documents locked by a password no one seemed to know. Investigators reached out to technology specialists and even consulted with national cybersecurity experts, determined not to overlook a single byte that might reveal intent, desperation, or communication with outside influences. Meanwhile, officers revisited the physical evidence again and again. Fibers stuck in the carpet were sent for microscopic analysis. Foreign hairs not matching any family member prompted DNA tests and cross-referencing with the state's growing criminal database. A used matchbook with a local bar's logo was bagged and cataloged. Had someone from outside visited the home or had a family member gone there in the days before the incident? The search for clues extended into the Morgan family's financial records, which were as tangled and intricate as spider silk. Detectives sat with accountants, combing through years of account statements, flagged transactions, and pages of bills stamped overdue. Patterns emerged: payday loans that ballooned overnight, large withdrawals of cash unaccounted for, even a bizarre transfer to an international account that set off alarms within the Financial Crime Task Force. These financial breadcrumbs hinted not only at desperation but possibly at others who had knowledge or leverage over the Morgans. The local community became both a resource and a fog of rumor. Tip lines rang day and night, some offering information about strangers seen in the neighborhood, others spinning elaborate conspiracy theories. One caller, claiming to be a delivery driver, described the Morgans as irritable and anxious, in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Another neighbor recalled seeing Thomas digging near the old oak tree late one night, a detail that sent cadaver dogs and shovels back into the garden for another sweep. All of it was documented, cross-checked, and either added to the labyrinth of leads or crossed off with heavy, exhausted pen strokes. Pressure mounted as days turned to weeks. Local media smoldered with speculation, and neighborhood forums erupted in heated debates about the possible involvement of family members versus outsiders. For the investigative team, discipline remained paramount. Each clue was plotted onto massive corkboards in the war room, string and colored pins tracing connections, timestamps, and relationships in a dizzying effort to see the case from every angle. Outside law enforcement, the broader apparatus of criminal investigation moved into high gear. Criminal profilers constructed psychological models of possible suspects, considering everything from stress-induced psychosis to motives rooted in revenge, desperation, or perceived betrayal. The search for Thomas and Linda took investigators to pawn shops, payday lenders, even nearby shelters, all locations logged and checked in an attempt to either find the parents or confirm they'd been seen alive after the children's murder. Multiple false sightings kept hope alive, but each lead collapsed under scrutiny, leaving behind only more unanswered questions. Throughout this relentless search, an undercurrent of exhaustion and frustration ran through the ranks. Detectives missed family dinners and watched the seasons shift from behind the thick glass of precinct windows. The community, meanwhile, found itself stuck in limbo, unwilling to believe that those closest to the children could have been capable of such horror, but unable to dismiss the mounting evidence pointing in that direction. And so, as the investigation pressed forward, an endless cycle of searching, testing, reviewing, and hoping, Evergreen Lane stood as a silent testament to how even in the most ordinary of American neighborhoods, every blade of grass, digital footprint, and whispered recollection might conceal or reveal the answers to a tragedy that no one ever thought possible. Narrowing down the circle of suspects. After endless shifts of poring over evidence and chasing leads across Reno and beyond, the investigation entered a new and challenging phase. It was time to start focusing, to sift the flood of rumors, witness statements, and technical findings for patterns or outliers that pointed to real suspects. The sense of urgency, already humming at fever pitch among the exhausted detectives, shifted into something sharper. A clinical drive to home in on whoever could possibly orchestrate such a tragedy. The community, in its heartbreak and shock, watched anxiously as the police stopped casting a wide net and began zeroing in on the people closest to the Morgan family, scrutinizing relationships that had once seemed steady and benign. The first step was a complete mapping of every interaction, favor, debt, and quarrel the Morgans had accumulated. Investigators started by re-interviewing neighbors, classmates' parents, business associates, anyone who had even a fleeting connection with the family in the 6 months prior to the tragedy. Walls of investigation rooms were gradually repurposed into intricate relationship webs, sticky notes, index cards, and headshots connected with color-coded string. Each strand represented a detail: who lent money to whom, who had been invited to the house, who stopped coming around, who had argued with Thomas or Linda over the fence in a hushed flurry of angry whispers. Late-night meetings brought together local detectives, forensic psychologists, and, eventually, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Patterns began to emerge as they cross-referenced visitor logs, phone records, and details from financial accounts. Who stood to gain from the Morgans' downfall? Was it a relative, a neighbor, a business associate, or someone no one had even noticed lurking at the margins of the family's life? Slowly, a list of potential suspects was drawn up, each entry meticulously documented, from distant cousins with a grudge to the couple's closest confidants. The process of elimination began with the obvious: establishing robust alibis. Detectives scheduled interviews and follow-ups with anyone whose stories didn't fit the timeline or whose whereabouts, no matter how inconsequential, couldn't be immediately confirmed. Some community members bristled at the idea of being scrutinized so intensely, their daily routines laid bare in service of a macabre investigation. Others welcomed the chance to help clear their names and perhaps aid in the search for truth. Fingerprints and DNA found at the Morgan home were cross-checked one by one, with voluntary swabs collected from all possible suspects: family, friends, house cleaners, landscapers, and even delivery drivers. Those who protested faced more aggressive follow-up, while the cooperative sometimes yielded tiny but significant clues: a fragment of a stranger's clothing fiber on the stairway carpet, a partial shoe print in the garden, or a DNA sequence from a coffee cup left in the sunroom. Parallel to the forensic effort, the profile of the suspected perpetrator was under constant revision. The behavioral analysis team whittled down personality traits and tendencies that would fit the odd constellation of facts at the crime scene: someone methodical, possibly with medical knowledge or experience restraining others, likely harboring significant personal grudges or having a stake in the family's collapse. Dr. Ellis, the lead profiler, stood before the team at a midnight briefing, pointing to traits gleaned from the scene. This was up close, intimate, and likely not the work of an outsider. We need to look closer to home, literally and figuratively. Almost daily, small victories nudged the investigation forward. A neighbor's doorbell camera revealed footage of a shadowy figure pacing outside the Morgan house late at night. A pawn shop owner remembered Thomas's uneasy manner while selling a family heirloom. A classmate's parent recalled Linda speaking cryptically about a storm coming, less than a week before disaster struck. Each of these threads alone might have vanished into nothing. Together, they formed a tapestry of motive and opportunity. As the list of suspects shrank, the focus tightened uncomfortably on those closest to the scene, especially family and close friends. The detectives faced the grim reality that statistically most violent crimes, especially those this methodical and intimate, come from within a victim's social or familial circle. Their resolve was tested as suspicions swirled around people who had organized candlelight vigils or dropped off casseroles during the dark aftermath of the killings. Direct questioning intensified. Those who had once spoken freely began to hesitate. Stress fractures appeared in the Morgan family's extended circle as old resentments bubbled up during interviews. Detectives took note whenever a subject contradicted a prior statement, showed unusual nervousness, or attempted to downplay their relationship with the Morgans. At the same time, police psychologists worked to parse what was real distress and what masked something more sinister. Distinct clues began tipping the scales. Canceled plans, unaccounted for gaps in alibis, hasty payments to creditors, and hurriedly deleted messages all signaled that the truth was closing in. Digital forensics teams traced the origins of several anonymous tip-offs, finding in some cases that they came from numbers linked to known acquaintances, not from the elusive strangers those tipsters claimed to have seen. And as the forensic evidence mounted, the investigators had to walk a delicate line with the public and the press. With rumors swirling, some implicating trusted community members, others concocting wild theories, the department was careful to neither exonerate nor implicate anyone prematurely. They issued updates emphasizing the ongoing pursuit of every angle, while privately focusing their resources ever more tightly on a handful of specific names. One surprising turn in the investigation came with the analysis of partially burned documents found in the Morgan's fireplace. Forensic reconstruction revealed fragments of correspondence with brief, desperate pleas for help, messages addressed to an old college friend and to a distant cousin. There was also a bank slip that hinted at an attempted overseas transfer, raising the possibility of either a failed escape or a payoff connected to the case. Every piece added tension. Were these signs of a family trying to flee together, or of someone seeking to silence dissent in the ranks? Late-stage interviews took on a confessional air. Some suspects broke down in tears, flooded by guilt or grief, not for the crime, but for failures to have stopped it, for not having intervened earlier, or for harboring personal grievances that now seemed meaningless in the face of loss. For detectives, it was a difficult line to walk between compassion and resolve, empathy and suspicion. They comforted those who had nothing to hide and pressed those who did. Social media, which had once buzzed with wild speculation, began to refocus as rumors clarified into consensus. The community's shock was replaced, in some quarters, by anticipatory anger and a thirst for answers. The narrowing suspect pool became a firestorm of whispers in every shop, school, and church in the area, sometimes further fueled by leaks or silhouetted figures in local newsreels. By the end of this phase of the investigation, there were few credible suspects left. The detectives understood that their role now was as much to provide closure as it was to seek justice. With all eyes on the handful of surviving suspects, the investigation took on a squarely personal dimension, and the answer, everyone sensed, lay not in the shadows but heartbreakingly close to home. The stark truth of family life. Behind the white picket fence and the cheerful seasonal wreaths of the Morgan residence, everyday life was far more fractured than the neighbors could have ever guessed. The Morgans, Thomas, Linda, and their 5 children projected the kind of outward normalcy that made them almost invisible in the rhythm of suburban life. Yet, in private, their world had become a pressure cooker, with every new day adding another layer of secrecy, anxiety, and desperation that no amount of tidy landscaping could disguise. Financial hardship was the first, and perhaps the most corrosive, crack in the family's foundation. Over years, Thomas and Linda's mounting debts, spanning business loans, credit cards, second mortgages, and advances borrowed against every insurance and retirement account, swelled to an astonishing sum. The exact amount shocked even seasoned investigators: over $700,000 owed to a chaotic web of local banks, digital lenders, former business acquaintances, and, in whispers, possibly even less savory sources. At first, these stresses seemed ordinary enough. Thomas, determined to keep up with the neighborhood's high-achieving standards, took on risky investments and pushed his modest contracting business far beyond sustainable limits. Linda juggled part-time jobs and private tutoring sessions as the bills stacked up, but it never seemed to be enough. Hidden from the prying eyes of the community, arguments between Thomas and Linda grew fiercer as the financial noose tightened. They fought long into the night in their kitchen, voices rising and then suddenly dropping to tense, hissing whispers when they were afraid of waking the children. Small things, a bounced check, a declined credit card at the grocery store, became catalysts for explosive blame. Even moments meant as family bonding like birthday parties or Saturday night movie marathons brimmed with an undercurrent of unease. Linda's quick, nervous glances at her phone, Thomas's tight-lipped silences when the doorbell rang, always dreading another creditor dropping by. The children, sensitive to the mood in their home, were not immune. David, the oldest, tried to shield his younger siblings and bore the brunt of his father's frustrations, often taking on extra shifts at the local hardware store to buy groceries. Mark found solace in routine, organizing his sister's backpacks each morning, methodically checking off chores as a way to wrest some control from the chaos swirling around him. Ben retreated to music, his guitar sometimes all that kept him company when the arguments downstairs grew unbearable. The 2 youngest, Jessica and Amy, clung to each other and spent more time at friends' houses, sensing that something was terribly wrong, even if they could not name it. All the while, the Morgans' efforts to keep their troubles secret only deepened their isolation. Linda withdrew from her book club and stopped hosting the neighborhood coffee hours she once enjoyed. Thomas, formerly gregarious, ducked out of community meetings, claiming work emergencies. Teachers noted changes in the children: incomplete assignments, sudden temper outbursts, and a tiredness etched in their faces. One school counselor attempted to reach out after Jessica was found crying in a hallway, but Linda reassured her that just a tough week at home was to blame. The illusion of normalcy was further shattered by a series of desperate attempts to make ends meet. Pawning family heirlooms, selling off treasured toys and electronics, even quietly seeking money from extended relatives, they tried everything. Their requests, at first framed as temporary setbacks, gradually turned more frantic. In the months before the tragedy, Thomas and Linda approached nearly every friend and family contact for loans, often spinning stories of medical emergencies, business opportunities, or urgent school expenses. Some relatives helped, but most began to step back, puzzled or wary of the couple's increasingly erratic requests. Bitterness and blame seeped into every crevice of family life. Accusations over who let it go so far, or who cares more about the kids, were whispered late at night, sometimes overheard by the older boys. There was talk, uncovered by investigators through fragmented text messages and partially burned letters, of separation, maybe even fleeing to start over somewhere new. On several occasions, bank tellers remembered Linda visiting, eyes swollen, asking about wire transfer rules and what would happen if you had to clear everything out at once. As the stress mounted, so too did Linda's anxiety and Thomas's anger. Medical records later revealed that both parents sought prescriptions for sleep aids and anti-anxiety medications in the weeks leading up to the killings. The family's internet search history, reconstructed by forensic teams, offered chilling evidence. Late-night queries about bankruptcy, home repossession, and, most notably, how families weather catastrophic debt. Throughout their communications there was a steady drumbeat of despair and fear of public shame, a sense that the Morgans could see no way out except through permanent escape. What made it even more devastating for investigators was seeing the relics of attempted hope, lists of possible financial solutions taped to the inside of kitchen cabinets, a spreadsheet on Thomas's laptop mapping out an impossible repayment plan, hand-drawn motivational notes left by the younger children meant to reassure their parents that things will get better. These details, small but potent, painted a picture not of monsters, but of people cornered by circumstance and overwhelmed by guilt, love, and a sense of insurmountable ruin. In the aftermath, the full extent of the Morgans' secret suffering would raise painful questions within the community. How could so much go unseen for so long? Would things have turned out differently if even one person had pressed harder, pushed through the couple's walls of pride and secrecy? For all the shock and horror that would eventually surround the family's fate, the underlying tragedy was not built overnight, but in quiet increments, sleepless nights, silent pleas for help, and choices made under the crushing weight of desperation. The investigation's conclusion and shocking revelations. As weeks bled into months, the investigation into the Morgan tragedy, by now a fixed point in the nightmares of an entire community, drew inexorably toward a conclusion few had anticipated in the early days of the case. What had started as a seemingly senseless act of violence in a nondescript suburban household gradually coalesced into a narrative so grimly logical, so tragic in its banality, that it upended every easy assumption about guilt, innocence, and despair. The final days of the inquiry would reveal layers of the Morgans' fate that left even hardened professionals awestruck in equal parts horror and empathy. The first confirmation came from a breakthrough in digital and physical evidence, fragments painstakingly matched by forensic analysts with the help of federal resources. Among the most fateful clues, high-resolution photographs recovered from a battered digital camera buried in a box of family mementos, and encrypted emails restored from Linda Morgan's laptop after weeks of technical labor. The images, time-stamped for the night of the killings, depicted the interior of the house in a somber, documentary style. No faces were visible, but the sequence and arrangements, body outlines, tightly drawn quilts, the placement of personal effects, revealed a chilling awareness of what was unfolding. But it was the correspondence that delivered the most damning pieces. Linda's emails, written with a tone of mounting dread, showed a woman mentally and emotionally cornered. She pleaded at several points with an unnamed confidant expressing terror about losing control, about the family estate being claimed by debtors, and she wrote that, "If we can't all get out together, then none of this matters." In these threads, investigators found clear premeditation, references to the purchase of toxins, discussions of sedatives, and the palpable echo of a couple united not in hope, but in ruin. Physical evidence solidified the picture. Receipts from a local pharmacy and a rare chemical supplier, both bearing Linda's signature, for a highly regulated extract. This extract, traced by toxicology experts directly to samples found in food remains and bedding within the Morgan home, was known for its lethality and, in the amounts discovered, left little doubt as to its intended use. More damning still, surveillance footage from a nearby hardware store showed Thomas and Linda, one day before the tragedy, purchasing rope, tape, and a double padlock, items recovered from the bathroom and used to restrain the children. The forensic timeline grew darkly precise. According to analysis, the sedatives had been administered to each child in their final meal, a familiar comforting dish that at the time must have seemed a small island of normalcy in the sea of stress. The methodical bindings, the arrangement of blankets and quilts, and the absence of visible struggle or trauma spoke to a meticulously planned act, cloaked in the language of a mercy that investigators found impossible to reconcile. In the wake of these discoveries, detectives combed through additional circumstantial evidence. Life insurance policies recently updated and set to pay out substantial sums in the event of accidental death. 2 attempted wire transfers to offshore accounts that failed, likely due to technical errors. Frantic Google searches on how to disappear, suicidal family pact, and dead after death laws. All of it pointed toward a scenario in which Thomas and Linda, consumed by financial terror and a siege mentality desperation, pursued what has come to be called a family annihilation, a catastrophic decision to destroy one's own lineage in an attempt to spare it from greater shame or suffering. Perhaps most haunting for all involved was the couple's seeming calm in the aftermath of the murders. Witness statements and traffic camera data placed Thomas and Linda leaving Evergreen Lane that night with only a pair of backpacks, walking without haste toward the outskirts of town. Their phones and credit cards were abandoned. They vanished completely, spurring a nationwide manhunt and countless false sightings over the next several years. The image of the missing parents became a symbol for both horror and ambiguity, their faces broadcast endlessly alongside the captions, "Wanted for questioning." It wasn't until a full 9 years later, when a pair of skeletons were discovered by an early morning hunter in the woods just 2 miles outside Reno, that the final puzzle pieces slid into place. DNA testing confirmed the identities of Thomas and Linda Morgan. Beside them, investigators found 2 empty bottles of pesticide, scraps of a handwritten farewell note, and the weathered remains of those same backpacks they'd taken from home. The manner of death was ruled suicide. The case, and public imagination, closed on a chillingly tragic note. Media coverage of the findings unleashed a new wave of reflection. Commentators and experts debated not only the mechanics of the investigation, but the societal forces, financial stress, social shame, the failure of support networks, that might drive otherwise loving parents to orchestrate such devastation. In candlelit vigils and online forums, the community's collective grief was tinged with anger, confusion, and a yearning for a different outcome. For detectives and forensic investigators, the Morgan tragedy became a touchstone case in future training on the warning signs of family collapse and the dangers of ignoring mounting mental health crises. In schools, teachers and counselors redoubled efforts to spot distress in children struggling with issues at home. Policy shifts followed, albeit slowly, in the form of new debt forgiveness proposals and mental health outreach initiatives for families under extreme stress. And yet, in the private reckoning that followed, no one quite knew where to lay blame. Some saw Thomas and Linda as ultimate villains, others as desperate victims of circumstance and a culture that punishes perceived failure without mercy. Whatever the final verdict in the court of public opinion, the Morgan investigation stood as both a cautionary tale and an elegy for an entire family swept away in a tide of secrets, silence, and overwhelming fear. Closing the case and remaining mysteries. After nearly a decade shadowed by tragedy and unanswered questions, the closing of the Evergreen Lane case became a defining moment, not only for investigators, but for the entire Reno community. The discovery of Thomas and Linda Morgan's remains in the wooded tract 2 miles from the suburban neighborhood finally provided resolution, at least in the legal sense. But the feeling among police, neighbors, and even the distant relatives who read about the case from other states was not of catharsis. Instead, the close of the case seemed to spark as many questions as it answered, allowing a complicated, enduring mystique to take hold around the Morgan story. From the outset, the case challenged every assumption about small-town America. Detectives had grown up believing that closure brings comfort, that a case file stamped "solved" would ease community pain and help survivors move on. Yet when the physical evidence, forensics, and psychological profiles all pointed with certainty to a grisly murder-suicide rooted in financial ruin and private despair, the reality felt far more ambiguous. The Morgans' home, once the site of laughter, family barbecues, and holiday lights, remained shuttered, its white facade quietly fading as prospective buyers and renters came and went, unable or unwilling to face the memories preserved inside. Local authorities held a final somber press conference to present the last official findings, detailing the forensic timeline, the personal effects recovered, and the painstaking work linking every scrap of evidence to Thomas and Linda's final days. The coroner's report spelled out the manner of their deaths with scientific detachment. The state's lead detective offered condolences and vocabulary about lessons learned. Yet a tension lingered behind their words, an unsaid acknowledgement that the most profound mysteries of the Morgan case might never yield to evidence or deduction. Channel 7's evening anchor summed it up best. The facts are clear, but the story remains haunted by silence. The neighborhood itself was slow to recover. The Morgan property remained vacant for years, and stories of strange sightings or unexplained noises began to circulate among residents. Some described seeing faint figures at the windows, hearing the soft tread of children's feet, or glimpsing lights flickering late at night. Whether these tales were fueled by grief, guilt, or a community's collective imagination, they became woven into the local folklore, a way for friends and neighbors to process what had happened. For every child who dared each other to run across the Morgan lawn at dusk, there were adults who quietly left flowers at the curb, unable to forget the family they once knew. What truly kept the mystery alive, even after the case's official close, were the loose threads and unsettled questions that the investigation never completely answered. Why had Thomas and Linda chosen such an irreversible path? Was it truly just debt and shame, or were there other pressures, unseen and unspoken, that pushed them over the edge? Investigators found no evidence of outside coercion, no hint of a broader conspiracy. Yet in every town hall meeting, every online forum, and every hushed conversation at the grocery store, rumors persisted. Maybe someone else had been involved. Maybe the parents didn't work alone. Maybe the truth had been shaped, subtly or not, by what the community was able or willing to believe. The psychological ripples traveled far beyond just those who knew the family personally. Local schools invited counselors to talk to students about grief and resilience. Churches and civic groups organized support groups not only to mourn, but to try to understand how families could break so disastrously beneath the surface. Law enforcement initiated new programs, training officers to recognize the early warnings of domestic crises, while social service agencies quietly reviewed their protocols for helping at-risk families before tragedy could strike. For the detectives most closely involved, the closing of the case brought relief mingled with frustration. Some officers struggled with second-guessing, wondering which interview, phone tip, or fragment of evidence they might have missed, and if there was more to the story than what forensics and timelines could show. Others reflected on the emotional toll. Late nights spent staring at uncooperative computer screens, the ghostly quiet of the crime scene, and the faces of 5 children whose futures would always remain a subject of what if. Journalists and true crime aficionados continued to dissect the story, posting long-form essays, producing podcasts, and proposing alternative theories that leaned into the ambiguities left behind. Some speculated on the existence of an unnamed accomplice. Others fixated on the psychological spirals and societal pressures that led 2 loving parents to commit an act that seemed, to outsiders, unfathomable. The Morgan case took on a near-mythic quality, reminding townspeople that not all endings tie up cleanly, and that sometimes the scars a story leaves behind matter as much as any official conclusion. Even as physical repairs to the house eventually began, new paint, fresh landscaping, and ambitious realtors' cheery "for sale" sign, the atmosphere around Evergreen Lane remained changed. Some families left the neighborhood, unable to bear the memories each time they passed the empty driveway. Newcomers whispered questions, and local children gave the house a wide berth, especially at twilight. It served as a lasting warning that tragedy can find cracks in the strongest-seeming walls, and that secrets, no matter how closely kept, can cast long shadows. In the private corners of the community, many grappled with guilt and regret. Teachers remembered the signs they might have missed, neighbors, the invitations left unspoken, extended family, the calls they hadn't returned. Every person who had brushed against the Morgan family, however briefly, found themselves reevaluating the casual cruelties and tiny mercies of their own everyday lives. In this way, the lingering mysteries of the case weren't about legal loopholes or criminal conspiracies, but about the endless capacity for people to both see and fail to see each other's pain. Ultimately, the closing of the Morgan case stood as a bittersweet milestone, a signal that answers, at least of the factual kind, had been given, but understanding would always remain elusive. The sorrow and strangeness left behind became woven into the very fabric of the neighborhood, shaping its identity long after the television vans rolled away. As spring turned to summer and new families arrived, the story of the White House on Evergreen Lane persisted as a cautionary tale, a warning whispered between generations, and a lasting reminder that even with an investigation closed, some mysteries are meant to linger. Echoes and rumors. The story of the Morgan house, already infamous from newspaper headlines and true crime podcasts, took on a spectral life of its own after the official investigation closed. The white 2-story home on Evergreen Lane stood empty for years, its windows shuttered, yard overgrown, and porch paint peeling beneath the weight of silence. When new owners or would-be renters came to view the property, neighbors watched from behind curtains, wondering who would want to dwell in a place linked forever with tragedy. Few families lasted more than a season. Some cited the relentless media attention, while others could not endure the uneasy quiet that seemed to press in from every unlit room at night. Whispered stories crept into local legend. Children dared one another to step onto the Morgan porch at dusk, claiming you could hear the echo of laughter if you listened closely by the door. Others promised that toy balls sometimes rolled from the shadows in the overgrown yard, or that lights flickered in empty upstairs bedrooms even when the power was shut off. Teens swore they'd seen pale reflections pacing behind the curtains, none of which was ever confirmed, but which became a rite of passage for growing up in that neighborhood. Some neighbors, especially the elderly who had watched the Morgan children grow, cared for the property in subtle ways, leaving flowers on the gate on anniversaries or quietly tidying up the walkway to honor memories lost. Rumors flourished in the vacuum left by unanswered questions. Community forums buzzed with theories after every creak or unexplained sound reported by a passerby, and ghost hunting enthusiasts occasionally staked out lawn chairs across the street, whispering excitedly into digital recorders while waiting for supernatural evidence. For every supposed sighting or recording, skeptics offered rational explanations: the drafty construction, reflections from passing cars, or the collective imagination of a town that couldn't let go. Over time, the house became more than a crime scene. It was the focal point for the anxieties and unresolved grief that no official closure could erase. For the next generation of children on Evergreen Lane, the house was both a test of bravery and a cautionary tale. Parents warned their kids to steer clear, ostensibly for safety, but in truth, to protect them from the weight of the story. Yet, on Halloween or during summer nights, brave souls still crept beneath the rusted fence, daring each other to peer in the dusty windows or tap on a boarded-up pane and sprint away. Some swore the air turned colder inside the gate, or that they'd heard distant sobbing drifting through the trees on windy evenings. Even those who dismissed such tales could not shake the subtle chill of passing so much loss made tangible. The store of rumors evolved along with the town itself. As new residents moved in, attracted by low prices or unaware of the backstory, they inevitably heard the whispers. Some left quickly, unnerved by the questions from neighbors or unable to sleep through the sense of unease that seeped from the walls. Others tried to reclaim the home, repainting walls, planting cheerful gardens, and inviting friends over for barbecues. Yet the story never quite loosened its grip. Every new owner or curious onlooker became briefly part of the ongoing folklore. Their departures or tenacity, their attempts to live among the echoes absorbed into the ever-growing narrative. Local media reawakened interest every few years, a new anniversary or the finding of some old Morgan photograph in a thrift shop, or a podcast revival of the unsolved aspects of the case. Each time, the rumors resurfaced. Some townsfolk claimed the Morgan's fate was a warning against the dangers of keeping secrets. Others insisted the house itself was cursed. That misfortune followed anyone who crossed its threshold. Whenever a storm knocked out power on Evergreen Lane, or a stray dog barked at shadows, the younger townsfolk joked, half serious, that it was just the Morgans checking in. More poignantly, the legend of the house became a way for the community to process guilt, longing, and the wish for a different ending. Teachers, clergy, and counselors referenced the case as a reminder to reach out for help in times of crisis and to check on neighbors, no matter how self-sufficient or content they seemed. Some older children who remembered the Morgan kids as classmates and friends started yearly rituals, anonymous cards on the porch, or lanterns set afloat on the anniversary night. Small acts meant to honor the memory but also to ward off the heavy silence that returned with each season. Beneath all the talk of ghosts and uncanny happenings, perhaps the most persistent rumor was that the Morgan house would never truly be a home again. The wounds left behind had been woven into the very foundation, and each attempt to repaint, refurnish, or forget could not quite blunt the edge of absence. In this way, the rumors and echoes were less about the supernatural than a testament to the lasting sting of what had happened. Shared grief transformed into a kind of oral history, a story passed from one neighbor to the next, with each telling shaped by sorrow, empathy, and a lingering hope that tragedy might one day lose its power to haunt.